Sight reading is one of the most important skills we can have as a church musician or a musician in general. Sight reading is a skill or the ability to read music accurately, quickly, and play what you're reading. However, sight reading is not so much a skill in and of itself, but rather a collection of skills which allow for the successful reading. As with so much of our education, we are told to study more, practice more, sight read more. But we are never told how to study, how to practice, or how to improve our sight reading. So we just bump along, learning largely by accident. First, let's get some very basic cognitive psychology out of the way. In the simplest terms, our memory has two levels, the short-term and the long-term memories. The short-term is just that, very short. For most of us, it lasts no more than 15 seconds and can contain no more than 5 to 7 chunks of information. When either of these capacities are reached, they begin to dump, which essentially leaves us with no memory of what we just did or tried to learn. And it takes between 5 and 7 immediate repetitions for any long-term retention. The time element is easy enough to understand. A chunk, and that's the actual technical term, is however much information one can contain in a single thought. This can be a single note or a passage with hundreds of notes. If you can see the entire thing and tag it with a single idea, which will yield all of those notes, it will fit in your short-term memory as a chunk. So the better you recognize musical patterns, whether they are chords or scales or other figurations, the better your sight reading will become. I know it can be a pain, but doing a careful analysis of chord progressions will greatly improve your reading. But playing is a far more complex activity, which still has to reside in this very strict environment. As a teacher, it is almost axiomatic that students try to do too much at a time. And I would suggest you not worry about playing hymns, but rather concern yourself with studying them. So with the limitations of your short-term memory, I would suggest that you only play one phrase at a time, repeating it 3 to 5 times before moving on to the next phrase. By doing your work this way, you will accomplish 2 important things. 1, you will gain familiarity with note arrangements found in that phrase. And 2, since you worked within the limitations of your short-term memory, some of this material will make its way into your long-term memory, and this will make future work that much more efficient. The more music you become familiar with, the quicker you will recognize note patterns and how they need to be played. A good reader of any language, musical or spoken, has a deep familiarity with all sorts of arrangements of the components of that language. As you work through these repetitions, you need to be constantly asking and answering this question: how can I remember that note? This will make you look for patterns and relationships between the notes. Musical language is highly patterned, and the more patterns you can find, the greater your retention. This question will also serve you well when you make mistakes, and mistakes will always happen. The most successful musicians are just as likely to err as any of us. The difference is they seek to understand why they made a mistake and to correct what caused that mistake, whether it was a misreading a note, forgetting an accidental, or a poor fingering choice. What I'd like to do now is to sight read a piece with you. This is a piece I have never played before, and the printing is a little poor, so I may end up stumbling over some visual problems. But nevertheless, I'm going to talk you through what I do when I first start a new piece. Its title is Palmos, and it's a tune that was used for a Isaac Watts hymn. My first observation is that we have one flat in the key signature, and by scanning through it, we start on a D minor chord and end on a D minor chord. So I'm going to assume we're in D minor, which means I'm going to be on the lookout for C sharps and B naturals as your primary accidentals. And if you look through it, towards the very end, we start getting C sharps. we are in common meter or 4/4 time, which means most likely we're going to see steady quarter notes with occasional eighth notes and sometimes longer note values. And that's what we see. We see lots of quarter notes, the occasional eighth note, even an occasional dotted quarter. But it fits within a very straight up 4/4 meter. Okay, so within that first phrase, I'm noticing we have the D minor chord for the first measure, and in the second measure, there's a slight variation on the second beat of the second measure, almost the repeat of the D minor chord. All we're changing is the D to C in the alto part. Beats 3 and 4 are repetition, and then we have to the F major chord there. So in that first phrase, I'm seeing lots of repeated things from one note to the next, or one chord to the next. So that makes it much easier to retain. And now musically, I'm noticing the next phrase begins on the fourth beat of that measure. So it's a pickup. So I'm going to treat it as if it's leading into the next. So the next phrase. Okay, I got caught in the fourth beat as I was examining the extra large reach in the bass and the tenor. So I had to make a quick decision to take the D in the right hand, which is simply the same note the alto was on. And then I observe our accidental in that one. And again, the harmony is being very stable. So, second phrase. Next phrase. Melody is breaking the D minor chord going up. We have the seventh here, which resolves. Okay, next phrase. Fourth phrase. All right. And I had to observe the cross relationship between the C sharp and the bass and the C natural and the soprano 2 beats later. That's what I had to check on. Make sure I was seeing that right. All right, so that's a bit of the procedure I go through when I'm first first reading through a hymn. I'm looking for actually breaks in the pattern, accidentals that come in, odd rhythms, anything I have to observe so that I can retain it, so that within a minute or two I'm recording that hymn. So those are just some of my thoughts on what it takes to sight read a piece of music. It can be applied to a solo piece or hymns. Hymns are a unique language which takes, just because one can play classical music does not mean one can play hymns. They're a completely different language. If you would like to learn more about my work on Christian hymnody, follow the link to my website. And if you'd like to contribute to this work, there are links to Patreon and GoFundMe in the description.